Thank you for joining us at the Combatants for Peace brief. And my name is Aziz, and I have Shai Goren with me. And we wanted to give you a briefing of update of what's going on. And I thought for a beginning, perhaps to start with a little bit of the background of how things have escalated so fast. Well, it has escalated so fast for those who haven't been maybe following the news in the last few weeks. For those of us who were there, who were seeing what's going on, it was, I think, a bit different. And maybe we didn't want to see it happening in the way it did, but honestly, it was in some ways predictable. So, Shai, maybe you can start with taking us through the past few weeks and what was going on and how did we end up where we are now?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Let's start. So to begin, we want to talk about what happened last month and how all of that month pretty much led up to where we are now. I want to add a few things just before we start, just a few facts on how things are on the ground here that would help us to get a better understanding of what's going on. So first of all, Israel is in the midst of a political crisis. It's been going on for 2 years. It's been going on since Netanyahu could not win an election, but also he did not lose. So we have kind of a tie or a draw between the two sides since 2019. We went to vote 4 times, and we're getting to the exact same result, pretty much. Each side has almost 50%, 51%, but they can't build a coalition. Now, Netanyahu stays in office until he is voted off, unless he's convicted in his court, he has a trial, it's going on, and unless he loses, he's still prime minister. So even if he does, if he doesn't win, and he draws, and we go to another campaign, he's still in office. And what happened throughout this month is that for the first time, we had kind of a counter coalition that tried to get Netanyahu out, to try to form this 51% that would able to change the government in Israel. And through that, the changes or the things that happened throughout this month happened. So just to give you some background. Second thing is the same or similar crisis that the Israeli police has been dealing or going through for the last 2 years. We have to remember that the police are the ones that are investigating Netanyahu. And as much as different groups in Israel don't see the police on their side, Netanyahu definitely doesn't see the police on his side, and he worked hard to weaken that police for the last 2 years. It means that the police was running without a commissioner for a while, and the commissioner that was assigned is pretty new. He only got in his chair a couple of weeks ago. He was never a district commander or commissioner in the police. He came from the border police, and that same goes for a new district commander for Jerusalem that obviously will come into the story right now. The police had a disaster under their responsibility about 3 weeks ago in Mount Meron in Israel, where over 40 individuals, Orthodox Jews, have died. And there's a lot of criticism about them as well. I'm adding a few more things. Itamar Ben-Gvir, that's the name of an Israeli parliament member, perhaps the most extremist, most right-wing that we ever had since Kahana himself. Itamar Ben-Gvir, who was a member of Kahana's organization. He doesn't denounce the organization itself, but he says that he's not a member of the organization anymore. He's a critical player to understand what's happening in the events right now. Extremely intelligent, well-spoken, and knows what he's trying to do. And he's on Bibi's side. He's in Bibi's block, but not on everything they see the same. We have to remember also that we have Ramadan, right? The holy month in Islam, that throughout this month is most of what we're going to talk about, and elections in the Palestinian Authority. We didn't have those elections since 2006. They were supposed to be done in May, and also they're a part of understanding what's the story. So when we're talking about the escalation, we have to remember that a lot of that has happened in Jerusalem. Jerusalem, throughout the history of the conflict, has been kind of the center in many of the different times that happened. And we can talk about maybe the demonstrations in Sheikh Jarrah that took part. Sheikh Jarrah is one of the most ongoing stories in the Israeli-Palestinian political scene. We're talking about individual Jews who are trying to go back into homes that they left there before 1948. When the Palestinian families that would be removed, would be evicted, they don't have any possibility to do the same, to go back into the territory that they left behind at the 1948 war. Those demonstrations have been going on for a while, for over a decade, but it seems the Supreme Court would push those evictions and would make them in the month of Ramadan. So the demonstrations in Sheikh Jarrah, which are Palestinian demonstrations backed by Israeli Jewish peace activists as well, have strengthened throughout the month. One of them, one member of the parliament, Ofer Kasif, from the joint list from Hadash, he was beaten severely by the police. I was there when that happened. It was a very non-violent demonstration, and the police was the one that came in and decided to escalate that. A couple of days after, at the beginning of Ramadan month, the police done something that they never done before. And what they've done was to shut down the main stairs in Bab el-Amud, in Damascus Gate, in one of the entrances to the old city of Jerusalem. Now, when we're speaking about Ramadan, we're speaking about a month of fast, obviously. We're also speaking about teenagers, about families that are coming at nighttime to walk around, to break the fast, to sit and smoke hookah, whatever they like to do. The police talked about shutting down what is a major amphitheater. It's not that big, but it's very important as a main entrance to the Palestinian city. And the police didn't really give a reason why. At the beginning, they talked about COVID, but Jerusalem, as annexed to Israel, is already beyond COVID. We're beyond that point. Then they talked about how those staircases are shut down every year, which was not true. And after 2 weeks, they would open up the blockings that they've done in the staircase of Bab el-Amud. But in the beginning of Ramadan, that created animosity between Palestinians and between the police. And that's happening only on the first day of Ramadan. A day after is the Israeli Memorial Day, or Eve of the Memorial Day for the fallen soldiers. There's a ceremony at the Western Wall, which is just across from Al-Aqsa, from holiest spot, or one of the holiest spots in Islam. And the Waqf, the religious organization running Al-Aqsa, talked about how Israel is shutting down the speakers during the call of worship on the second day of Ramadan because of a ceremony that happened at the Western Wall, also adding to the story. The next day, we're already at the midst of April 15. We see the first video on TikTok done by Palestinian youth or teenagers that are, in this specific case, beating an ultra-Orthodox or slapping him in the light rail in Jerusalem. That video gets online on TikTok app and becomes viral. And that starts a few more videos like that of Palestinians attacking Jews in the streets of Jerusalem. Now, a week after all of that, we're already at April 22nd, and an organization called Lahava, one of the most radical, extremist, right-wing Jewish organizations in Israel, are deciding to retaliate on what they call the hurt in Jewish pride. This is a term that we'll hear throughout the last month, and we're still hearing it in what's happening in the last week. So what they see, of course, as a hurt in Jewish pride in Jerusalem. They call for people, they call for youngsters to go in the streets of Jerusalem to look for Palestinians and to beat them up. And during that night, the police arrest some of them, but the police also goes and attack Palestinians in the streets of Jerusalem. And we end up with dozens of injured Palestinians and people who are arrested. So 3 days after that, by the end of April, the commissioner of the police understands that shutting down the staircase of Bab el-Amud of Damascus Gate was a mistake. Doesn't say it was a mistake, but he opens it up. And there is a big Palestinian celebration in the gate at that night, and maybe also an understanding that the police and the commissioner of the police and the heads of the police are not strong enough. And maybe they don't know exactly what they're doing, and there's a way to change the police decisions by attacking them. On the next day, which is April 26th, Abu Mazen Mahmoud Abbas decides that he's canceling the elections. Now, in Palestinians' elections, I said it didn't happen in 15 years, and most assumptions were that Hamas would win the elections if they happen. That's why Israel pushed Abu Mazen Mahmoud Abbas to cancel those elections, and that's perhaps why Abbas himself decided to cancel those elections. But anyway, for Hamas, that was a hit in canceling the elections that they were supposed to win. And that, of course, is adding to what we're talking about. A couple of days after that, in the beginning of May, the demonstrations in Sheikh Jarrah are getting stronger and stronger. And for the first time in a couple of years, we start to see Arab citizens of Israel or Palestinians and Israelis that are coming to the demonstrations from all over the country, especially from up north, from al-Fahim. There's also a demonstration in al-Fahim talking about Sheikh Jarrah, and we start to hear more and more about the story of Sheikh Jarrah in those days. And then on May 5th, for the first time, Netanyahu's attempt to build a coalition fails, and the mandate to build a new coalition in Israel is given to his opponent, Yair Lapid, who still has the mandate. He still has a couple more days to go right now as we speak. But it seems for Netanyahu that he could be overthrown from his position by a coalition that will be both right-wing, centralist, and left-wing parties within Israel. And that obviously changes everything up. Itamar Ben-Gvir, the extremist parliament member that I mentioned, shows up at the city of Lod, which is a mixed city in the borders of Israel where Palestinians and Israelis live. We're going to be talking about that city as well, because many of the issues are related to Lod. And on the next day, May 6th, he transfers his bureau, his office, into Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, which is pretty much a desk in the middle of the streets of Sheikh Jarrah. And on the next day, May 7th, we are starting to see severe clashes between the police and Palestinians at Al-Aqsa Mosque. I remind you, we are in the middle of Ramadan at that point. People are fasting. These are very holy days in the Muslim calendar. By the end of Ramadan, the police enters the mosque itself and throws stun grenades at the people worshiping themselves inside of the mosque in a clinic that's on the top of the mountain. And anyone who knows anything about Jerusalem knows that the holiness of Jerusalem is the most sensitive part. And obviously Al-Aqsa during Ramadan, that is a major change. I don't remember when that happened in the last couple of years to see the police acting like that. On the next day, May 8th, the police stops vehicles of Palestinians riding on buses, Palestinians and Israelis that are coming from up north to Al-Aqsa, to Jerusalem. And after 3 hours of delaying them on Route 1, on the major route between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, the police changes his minds or cancels whatever they did and decides that they enable the people, the Muslims, to come pray at Al-Aqsa. Once again, we're seeing stun grenades at Al-Aqsa. And 2 days after that, we're already at Monday, which is just a couple of days ago. We have what is known as Jerusalem Day. Jerusalem Day is the day celebrated by Israeli Jews, mostly from the right wing. There aren't so many Israelis that are related to that, I have to say. And they're celebrating the unity of Jerusalem, the fact that Jerusalem was won in the Six-Day War. Throughout that day, we see severe clashes mostly between police and between Palestinians in Al-Aqsa. Once again, the police enters and shoots stun grenades. Then at one point, the Palestinians are shooting back at the police and a tree is set on fire. Then I remind you that we're seeing the video of young Israeli teenagers or settlers, national religious, that are chanting and singing at the bottom of Al-Aqsa, which means at the Western Wall, as it seems as Al-Aqsa is on fire. The question of who started the fire and is any of the mosque on fire is not really relevant, because once this video is on, that I think changes everything. Now we have to remember that Netanyahu waits every time until the last second before he commits to do what the security professionals are telling him to do. For example, during Jerusalem Day, we have a procession, a parade that walks around Jerusalem. And usually the settlers enter from Damascus Gate, same one we talked about, and they walk all the way down to the Western Wall, shouting and chanting, Muhammad is dead, and death to the Arabs. Most Palestinian shop owners, they leave very early on that day, so they're very afraid of the reactions from the Israeli settlers. And Netanyahu decides to wait until the last second to change the route of the parade. Although all the professionals are telling him what to do, so in the end, he can say, okay, I did what I was supposed to do, but he really does it at a point that it's not relevant anymore. Because at that point, Hamas joins in and gives an ultimatum that if until 6 o'clock on that day, the route will not be changed and Sheikh Jarrah will not be left by both police and settlers, then they will shoot a rocket to Jerusalem. And so they do. The first rocket on that day is shot to Western Jerusalem, not inside the city. And from that day, what we're seeing is retaliation of the Israeli army and retaliations of Hamas from Tuesday of last week, which is May 11th. Most of Israel is under rockets, and obviously Gaza itself is under severe rocket threat. In Israel, we're talking about cities like Tel Aviv that's been targeted multiple times, although that's not something that happens, I can say, every day. And in Gaza, we're talking about a major attack by the Israeli Air Force going to targets that they also wouldn't go before that. But what's also happening in the same time is that we start seeing clashes between Israelis and Jews throughout mixed cities in Israel, which is what I see as the most troubling part, or perhaps not, perhaps the rockets are worse, but since this is in a way something we haven't seen before on that scale, this is something that I see important to emphasize. We're talking about Jews who are lynching Arabs in cities within Israel. We're talking about Arabs who are lynching Jews in cities in Israel. We're talking about severe violence that's been happening in the last couple of days. As I told you before, the police on many times is not anywhere to be seen. People are calling the police, begging them to come in. Sometimes they show up, sometimes they don't. And we are thrown to a circle of violence that is on a scale that I've never seen in my life. This is what happened on the last month. And obviously we're going to go into details of, but remind one thing, that the majority of the people living in Israel, obviously both Muslims and Jews and Christians and Druze, they are not violent people. And when we are talking about the clashes and we're talking about riots and we're talking about lynches, these are not thousands of people each time, not even a few hundreds of people each time. It depends. Usually it's a couple of maybe 50 or 60 people per time. And what's happening is that the majority of Israelis, either Palestinians or Jews, are silent, are at home, are afraid. And at the same time, extremists on both sides are leading what start to be seen as the beginning of a civil war. On just 2 days ago, the commissioner of the police, Shabtai, has mentioned Itamar Ben-Gvir, the parliament member that I've mentioned before, as the major cause of this intifada. Ben-Gvir himself says Shabtai is looking after him because Shabtai doesn't know what he's doing and the police doesn't know what they're doing. But we have Israeli professionals and the commissioner of the police saying that he understands where the incitement is coming from. And as Israelis, I have to say it, and everyone that I spoke to in the last couple of days, either they support Netanyahu or not, they understand that this issue will not happen if it wouldn't be for the coalition or change coalition, counter coalition of Netanyahu to almost happen. During 2 days ago, Naftali Bennett was supposed to replace Netanyahu with Yair Lapid, gave a statement that this is not the right time to build a coalition that will be based on shared understandings between Israelis and Arabs. This is out of the question anymore. He will try to form a coalition with Netanyahu or to go to elections, which on one hand is something that is devastating for us Israelis, but also we believe that if Netanyahu got what he wanted to begin with, that might start pushing him to have a ceasefire and to end the war, at least the part that is between Gaza and between Israel. Aziz, I spoke for ages.
Yeah. So I only want to comment, and while I'm doing that, please, if you have any thoughts, any questions, especially, please feel free to send it to us. We'll be happy to answer your questions. And it was important for Shai to give this introduction because, again, I think if you've not been following what's going on, you think, why is Hamas shooting rockets? Why is Israel bombing Gaza? What's happening over there? And only really if you've been following, you understand how these things happening. And obviously, I don't mean it in a sense of justification. I mean it in a sense of understanding how things escalate over in our country. But a few things I think really important to understand when it comes to nuances of what's happening over in Israel and Palestine. One is the issue of Sheikh Jarrah is not an isolated issue. The same thing that Sheikh Jarrah is going through, where settlers are coming and saying, well, this property is ours, based on a law that only gives a property to Jews who can claim it. If they own the property pre-1948, they can come and claim it, but does not allow Palestinians to claim property in West Jerusalem. These same families that Shai talked about, actually own property in Haifa and have no right to go back to that property. They are refugees themselves. They've been displaced multiple times since 1948, and yet they can't do that. But this is not the only place that have similar problems. Wadi Joz, which is 5 minutes walk actually from Sheikh Jarrah, it's more or less the same neighborhood. The whole neighborhood is supposed to be, it's an industrial area that's supposed to be basically all removed, and instead building this high-tech kind of park there, which in reality, most Palestinians don't believe they will benefit whatsoever from it. It will remove the Palestinians there and pretty much bring Israeli Jewish businessmen to run it. Another area is Silwan, which is in the other side of East Jerusalem, which also 88 homes are under threat of being demolished to build the King's Garden, which is part of the city of David. So you have multiple of these, and Jerusalem feels like, if you are from Jerusalem, you feel you are always under threat of being displaced. And that's part of this anger, this feeling of like, oh, it's not just a few families we need to help. This is all of us might be in the same place at any point. And then you add to it the issue at Al-Aqsa Mosque and soldiers coming in claiming that some guys threw stones. And I'm not going to argue that it didn't happen. It's likely that it did. But to me, it's amazing hearing that and hearing, oh, well, some guys threw stones and therefore the army had to come in and literally go inside the mosque with their boots, which if you understand anything about Islam, you know, this is for any mosque, it's a major problem. For Al-Aqsa Mosque, it's one of the holiest place for Muslims in the midst of Ramadan, coming in, throwing stun grenades, shooting at people and wounding hundreds of people. It's a crazy, considering that just yesterday I'm looking at videos of from clashes happening and I see settlers, and I mean settlers because they've been bussed in from cities in the West Bank to Lud especially to come and provoke locals there and attack locals there, while the soldiers standing next to them, they throwing rocks at Palestinians. And my mind goes, wait, so you started this whole mess going into the mosque, shooting at people because, oh, we can't allow throwing rocks to happen anywhere in the country, but you're standing protecting as soldiers actual young people throwing rocks. How is that even? I guess for me, it means the whole thing at Al-Aqsa Mosque wasn't really about the rocks. And that's, I can't tell you what was behind it, how the decisions were made, but I'm not buying that, oh, well, 5 guys, 10 guys, 20 guys threw rocks, therefore we had to come in and do what we did as the soldiers. So that's second. And then another thing really important, look, we have a lot of divisions in our own Palestinian community. One of those divisions is between those who live in who have Israeli citizenship, and those of us in Jerusalem and the West Bank. And when the police stopped the Palestinians from who have Israeli citizenships from the Triangle, from Haifa, from Al-Fahim, to come to pray in Jerusalem, what they did, I actually was stuck in that same traffic, which lasted for hours. They got off their buses and said, we're going to walk to Jerusalem. They would not have made it in time for prayers, because you're talking about 15 kilometers, 10 kilometers. So it would have taken them a whole 10 hours to get to Al-Aqsa Mosque. But Palestinians in Jerusalem started driving to pick them up. And it created a solidarity, a relationship, a communication between those two communities that had never, I think, existed in the last few years. It united, the actions of the police in some ways have united Palestinians in a way that we haven't seen before. And that, I think, part of the reason why you think you see places like Lud and like Nasra and like Sakhnin and like Kufr Kanna are erupting inside Israel, more than the West Bank even, are erupting and saying, we're not okay with what's happening. We're not okay with what's going on in our own lives, but definitely in what's going on in Jerusalem. And this connection, I think, the Israeli police makes between people who are citizens of Israel and people who are in the West Bank and people who are in Gaza, there is a strong connection to people in Jerusalem. All Palestinians have that connection. And for some reason, the Israeli government, the Israeli police doesn't see that connection. Another point I think is really important to understand, those protests in Jerusalem, these protests within Israel, these protests in Sheikh Jarrah, were not led when they started by any political party, not Hamas, not Fatah, not the Palestinian Authority. If anything, the Palestinian Authority didn't want this to happen. I think they still the most who are trying to stop the escalation. Palestinians are very angry at the Palestinian Authority because the Palestinian leadership is refusing to actually even make any statements that would come across as escalation. That's how Palestinians see it. Israelis, I think, see it totally differently. They have stopped in the last few days people from arriving to checkpoints. They failed yesterday of doing that. But for the first 3-4 days, they actually had the Palestinian police stopping people from arriving to checkpoints because they were trying to limit the casualties. And yesterday there were 10 people, 11 people in the West Bank who were killed in those clashes. So, but the protests themselves were not politicized. They were really community led. The protest in Sheikh Jarrah was not any Palestinian political party. Actually, when you go there, you'd realize there's an absence. And in some ways, maybe that's why those protests were more successful than we used to, because they were not political. Hamas, in some ways, were understood they can capitalize on people's anger. They can capitalize on gaining popularity in this time. I'm not sure 100% if they would have won the elections if we had elections. I think they would have lost in some areas one and another. They would have been much stronger than the Palestinian Authority, for sure, than Fatah. 100% they would have been much more popular. But Fatah itself is splitting up right now too, to multiple parties. So these are some of the thoughts that's coming to my mind. And as we watch what's happening today, as we watch what's happening within Israel, Arab towns, joint cities, or watching what's happening in Gaza, I really don't know how do you de-escalate, but also not go back to the norm. And in that's really important. Going back to the norm of continuing light occupation kind of is also shouldn't be acceptable. So in these days, I hear kind of two voices, and that's important for us Palestinians as we're talking about it. When we hear those voices, I hear voices who are like Shai, who says this needs to stop, this can't continue, but also the whole policies that created this mess, the whole policies of occupation needs also to stop. And that I find a lot of common ground with. But at the same time, I hear a lot of people who says, yeah, we need calm. Let's go back to the norm. And next week, let's go and evict those families. Let's displace them from their homes. But let's do it in a nicer way. And that's very frustrating to me, because calm in itself isn't the goal, because you get calm for another year and then we get in this again. We need to really be working. And how do we stop the occupation and these policies? How do we work within Israel and making a more inclusive society? What Bennett said to me is absurd. Oh, look, the whole country is falling apart. Arabs and Jews are killing each other. Therefore, we should not build a government that have Arabs in it, because that would be crazy. You'd think the exact opposite would be what the country needs right now, is to bring more people together. And yet the policies that might come out of this round of violence, unfortunately, could lead toward more division and toward more sowing hatred. And so we have a lot more work to do ourselves. So I would stop maybe here and see if we have either other questions, or Shai, if you have any comments on what I just mentioned.
I'll comment, and then I'll be happy also if we'll go to questions. But I think what we're seeing in the last week happening in Israel is that many of the things that we expected, that we anticipated on some level, that we warned about as peace activists and the left wing in Israel, are blowing up in our face. And many assumptions that we had is something that the mainstream Israeli narrative just wouldn't accept. Even the word occupation that both you and I are using is something that's very difficult for Israelis to even comprehend. So when we're talking about some of those things, like let's try to put them in context, right? Even Sheikh Jarrah, that went to the headlines in the Israeli newspapers and obviously all over the world, even if that was understood as something that Israel is doing wrong, and we have a good number of Israelis that will say, okay, I won't go to demonstrations, but I get that there's something that is the morals there are just wrong and we're doing something false. Once Israel started receiving rockets from Hamas, that is what Netanyahu anticipated, and that would kind of unite the Israelis together. And this is what we're hearing in the last couple of days, that until the rockets were shot on Monday, we had some understanding by the Israelis that our own police was doing wrong, that our own politicians were doing wrong. But when you think about it, these are the things that led to the escalations, were the things that we did in the last years. Talking about Hamas, for example, like look at the scenario right now. Hamas is shooting rockets in Israel, that's Gaza. And then you have East Jerusalem that is on fire, and that's under Israel. It's next to Israel. The most calm area, relatively, is the West Bank. And the West Bank is Abbas, and the West Bank is the Palestinian Authority. And we know for years that Netanyahu didn't have any way to deal with Hamas. And what he did was to allow the money to enter from Qatar to Hamas itself. We're talking about $1 billion that came in during the last 5 or 6 years or so. And maybe half of that money went for Hamas members themselves and not to the people of Gaza. We had it coming. We knew what Netanyahu was trying to do. And Netanyahu, his thoughts were that if he can separate Hamas and Abbas, then Hamas are an easier target for him. Because Hamas doesn't have the legitimacy, Hamas hurts civilians, and Abbas, if he takes over fully, then this is something that will be much more difficult to solve. We knew that. This wasn't news for the Israelis. But still, as long as things were relatively quiet, then maybe we knew how to deal with that. And maybe same thing goes for the mixed cities. So you mentioned Lod, which is a city that I don't remember when we talked about, like obviously like we talk right now. But Lod was a Palestinian city up till 1948. And after 1948, after the War of Independence, Nakba, Lod became a city with a majority of Jews and a minority of Palestinian citizens of Israel. Akka is the same story. The percentage are very similar. What we're seeing in those cities is that the Israeli government has intentionally, I would assume, neglected those cities and chose one group over the other, chose religious Jews who are entering those cities in the last decade and chose where the money would go to. So if this is something that was very obvious in Jerusalem, because East and Western Jerusalem is so clear where the line used to be and where the money and the budgets go to, those things were kind of behind the table. I don't know how many Israelis knew about that, about what's happening in those cities. I don't know how many Israelis knew what the Palestinian society within Israel are experiencing. So if you're talking about guns, right, unauthorized guns, so the Palestinian Israeli leaders have talked for the last decade about this issue, about unauthorized guns on huge numbers within the Arab society in Israel. But what I think the Israeli Jews told themselves was, as long as they shoot one another, this is not our problem. And why should we try to solve something like that? And maybe we'll get to that one day, but for sure, that's not an urgent necessity. And now we see the table starting to turn as in severe issues that were either neglected or pushed by the Israeli government's tactics are now coming back into the society in Israel. And that's what's scaring a lot of Israeli Jews. And they're saying, oh my God, what's going on? When actually many of those things were going on before, but since they weren't the target, they didn't think that this is something that they have to deal with. So the shock, I think, is very big. Also, the shock that Palestinians are united to a shared idea. How could it be that the person from Lod would care about Jerusalem? Well, guess what? That's exactly what's happening. And this is also no major surprise. But that's how Israelis see it. And once again, once the rockets started to come in, it is very difficult to question Israelis on those matters when they run to shelters. And that needs to be said as well, as Israelis are running down in the last couple of days. You're muted, Aziz.
Zoom is silencing me. No. Should we start answering some questions? I'll take a couple. Let's see. Are there any leaders who can bring people can bring together all this tremendous energy and desire to end the oppressive system? I think part of the problem is that, like, I think what Shai, you just mentioned now, people kind of know about some, but don't know about a lot. I listening to media now, it's frustrating listening to media now because it's like, well, very propaganda, I would argue, just like in the US in some ways when you're dealing even with local issues. So it's very challenging. Who are the leaders? I think there are a lot of community leaders who are trying to make a difference. Some of those community leaders are here in the combatants groups, but there are others community leaders. When it comes to politicians, I'm a lot more skeptical. I mean, Palestine have had the same leader for 15 years, so have Israel had the same leader for quite a while. We stuck with our leader without elections because we can't vote. So in some ways, maybe we are excused. Israel keeps voting for the same dude forever. So I know it's I'm not as hopeful on political leadership.
Yeah, I agree with you. We have an issue here with leadership, and I think that on Netanyahu's block, we don't see any reason why to try to calm things down. And I think that's working for one political group within Israel. The other political group is anyone else in a way, and we see Lapid in the Israeli political system that is well spoken and speaks about those things. But I think we need something greater here. I'm seeing members of Meretz and members of the Joint List, and I think people are genuinely trying to do that. But on some level, maybe the feeling is that since politicians are not perceived as people that we should listen to, then what difference does it make? Did they denounce this? Did they denounce that? So on this level, maybe the train has left the station. But local leaderships, definitely, as you mentioned. The area around Jerusalem, like west of Jerusalem, is a mixture between Arab and Jewish cities within Israel. So we're talking about in Rafah, and about Abu Ghosh, and about in Akuba, Mevaseret Zion, Kiryat Anavim. And those municipalities actually joined up for demonstrations that are talking about shared life and how we see the future together. Because once again, and I know I said it before, I think over 95% of people living in Israel are sitting at home right now and they're freaking out. And by sitting at home, and I'm not blaming them, these are really stressful days and rockets are being shot. We are letting other people take the stand. We're letting extremist groups coming into the cities, lynching one another, and just making the other 95, 98%, or whatever that is, 99, just play a game that we don't want to play. And the challenge would be to overcome that, to see if we can bring people together in demonstrations, in anything. I saw school principals that are talking about it, people who are working in education. That I think is the hope
But
that we
Shai,
have
I'm
here.
I'm gonna
Yeah,
challenge you a little bit here, and
please.
this is true in the Palestinian side. Is this? I think we are every time this kind of thing happens, we all get radicalized. And yes, while 98% don't want to see violence and killing, I see even people who I know are writing me and saying, it's all your fault. It's all Hamas's fault. Or Palestinians are like, we've been struggling for so long, no one's listening. Now that there are rockets, suddenly the whole world is listening. Screw that. I see that a lot among friends, among people I know. And these are people who were never radicals, who are I feel being radicalized. And then obviously kids who are going through this, whether it's kids in Gaza who seeing their homes being destroyed, kids in Tel Aviv who have to go to the shelter, kids in Lud, Arab and Jewish kids. The videos are horrifying from these places. It is scary to me how radicalized people become. And in some ways, it's worrying me because after the second intifada, I think we lost a generation who've become much more radicalized because of the second intifada, because of the violence that happened there. And it worries me that every time this happens, it only gives strength to people on the extremes.
Listen, it's much easier to break down what we're trying to build for many years. And building those relations, and you know better than me, that bringing Israelis and Palestinians together to listen to one another and to talk, this is a major issue. I mean, it's really difficult. It's taken a long time. And what one rocket or one lynch or one shot in Al-Aqsa would do is devastating. And I think it is difficult to try to, I don't know, get a realization on days like this, honestly. And I think people are unifying within their group and they're thinking out of a very scared moment in their life. And maybe we need those days to kind of, I don't know, to disappear, and then we start building those things again. Um, I guess it's not a perfect answer, but that's how I see it. Yeah, when people are intimidated, and this is the time to talk about empathy to who is perceived your enemy. That's a very difficult thing to do. So I don't know if that's something that couldn't happen in the future, but definitely every rocket and every day that we're passing in this war would make it much more difficult for us to build those things on the next day. I agree.
All right. I'm going to put two questions together and the two of us can take a stab at it. Will you also address US right wing funding settlers and right wing? And then what's the role of international contribution to this crisis, which kind of fits all together? What's really the role of international community and from the US as an example? Do you want to start? And we have a
Yeah,
lot of questions. So
we have a
let's,
lot. Okay.
both of us, let's start shorten our answers.
Yeah. So let's try one after the other. First of all, international community plays a huge role in any crisis in the Middle East, definitely the ones of Israel, Palestine. And we know that these are the things that are pushing for a ceasefire. This is also one of the things that we are addressing and asking people who are watching us right now to do. If you're American, especially, and you have your congressman that you know, please call them, call their offices, talk to them about the importance of ceasefire here in the region, and try to push for those things. We've been doing those things from here, and it's vital that we will get that help done from outside. Biden's administration is new, and so far haven't done so much on the war that's been going on the last couple of days. There is no American ambassador here, and I guess it's limited. And we also know that America or the US talked to Israel about how maybe the war would go on until Sunday and then they will start pushing more. But any help we can get on that will be very important. And if there's one thing that you can do once you leave this conversation, and that will be it, this will be much, much needed and appreciated.
I
Second question of this, or yeah, go ahead.
I think you answered kind of both in some ways, the international contribution to the crisis and the US right-wing funding settlers and settlements.
Yeah,
I,
Aziz, can I jump in on that?
I'll add to that just quickly that if you, so a week or two ago, former Israeli ambassador to the US made a comment that was interesting. He said, we need to stop investing in Jewish Americans to defend Israel and move our investment as a state of Israel toward the evangelical Christian community. And his reasoning was the evangelical Christian community is 25% of the United States, while the American Jews are not. And then he said American Jews are more likely to be critical of Israel. So let's not worry about American Jews and just focus on Christians. And that's important because some of that money we talking about that comes to support settlements isn't necessarily, or at least not only coming from Jewish Americans. There is quite a bit of support that coming from the Christian community, the evangelical community, that in most cases, I have to say, you can't just look at it as these are evil. I think in most cases are misled. In most cases are they want to do good and they think, oh, well, helping the Jews here and because of biblical reasons is good. And that adds another layer to our work, to our activism of reaching these communities and speaking with these communities and explaining to them displacing somebody isn't really what God would have wanted you to do. Actually, there are tons of scriptures about that, from the Hebrew Bible to the Christian Gospels, from Habakkuk, where it says, woe to him who builds a city by crime and establishes a town by a bloodshed. This is not, regardless of how religious or secular you are, but if you are religious, this is not, I can't imagine somebody believing this is how God wanted it to be. A war every few years, tons of kids being killed. And we have to do much more to reach those communities. Beth, you
Yeah,
wanted to say
I
something?
do. Hi, I'm Beth. I'm the director of American Friends of
Can we
CFP.
spotlight you or you spotlight yourself? I'm looking for you
Do that.
just so we can see you. Yes, go
Thank
ahead.
First, I apologize for the tech issues. I know a lot of you came late. We will send out a recording, so you can send it to all your friends and family. And second, I just want to jump in here with this question. So the right wing, and especially the evangelical community, pour billions of dollars into settlement construction, into military equipment. Between the government and the evangelical community and the right-wing community, they're getting billions. The peace community is, fighting over pennies. So it really falls on us, to be honest. It really falls on the support of you all and our community to fund this movement, because we're up against something huge. And it really does depend on us. So I just wanted to throw it out there that anything you all personally can do to help, making contributions to Combatants for Peace and other anti-occupation and left-wing peace groups, it really makes an impact. And we're up, considering how much we're up against, it really, really makes a difference. And I just wanted to emphasize that to you all, because yeah, so sorry, I'm gonna jump out again, leave it back to the guys in the questions.
Yeah, I'm going through the questions now, just trying to figure out which ones do we take next. There are so many. If Beth, you have any thoughts on that, please tell us. I'll just say one that here comes out. There's a question about why now, why these evictions are energizing Palestinians who are citizens of Israel. These evictions in Sheikh Jarrah also happened 3-4 years ago, and there was protest, but not to this level. Or level was absolutely nothing like the past few weeks. So why now? I think a few reasons. One, this happened in Ramadan, and I have to say it does make a difference. People are more community oriented in Ramadan, but also it happened at Sheikh Jarrah and Al-Aqsa Mosque together at the same time. And so the two topics ended up becoming one, and people who were fighting for Sheikh Jarrah became part of Al-Aqsa mobilization and vice versa. And that did make a huge difference. But the second I mentioned is that it's becoming not only Sheikh Jarrah. The whole issue in Wadi Joz is a new issue. Wadi Joz is, as I said, just walking distance from Sheikh Jarrah, and to demolish this whole industrial area there that I grew up, right? Like going there, I played there. My cousins live literally walking distance from it, my uncle. So as these threats have become, it's becoming clear. It's not just a one house, a two houses, a four houses. This is a larger plan. I think it has scared a lot more people. And then add to it something that's גרעינים התורתיים, איך אומרים את זה בעברית? I don't know.
Let's call it the גרעינים תורניים, the religious seeds, we can say.
Yeah, religious seeds. There's these religious seeds, kind of like a settler groups ideology, who are also starting to not going into the West Bank, actually going into these joint cities, especially Jaffa, Lud, these areas, and starting within the Arab areas, within the Palestinian areas there. And that started to upset and scare a lot of the Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, as they seeing these ideological groups coming to their own neighborhoods and worrying of what does that mean for them. So that, I think that's another reason, is finding some common ground on, wait, these are the same people who are doing it in Jerusalem, also doing it in our own neighborhoods, trying to change our neighborhoods, and we don't want to see that happening. So I'm assuming that's part of it. Shai, do you want to pick a question?
Yeah, I got a question here of what do you want from the USA and Biden? Which is a fair question, right? We have our own conflicts. Why are we pushing or pulling the US into that? The US has been the best mediator that we had in the last couple of decades, and it had its presidents, and obviously the last president has picked his side. But on things that we cannot agree, we are using what the American mediators, or any mediator, just happened to be that the Americans were doing that. So when we're talking about the split of Jerusalem and the way that we would like to see the future in Jerusalem, we're using what is known as Clinton parameters from the early 2000s, right? From 20 years ago, talking about how Jews should live, or the Jewish part of Jerusalem in the future will be a part of Israel, the Palestinian part will be a part of the state of Palestine if of course, an agreement would come. And that, of course, is a violation of that, which is something that's understood and accepted by the two sides whenever we go to a peace campaign. A violation of that is Sheikh Jarrah, right? Removing or evicting the Palestinian families and Palestinian neighborhood and building a Jewish one instead. Without those things and without fair mediation in those talks, we have a very difficult time. We need to remember that Israel's power over the Palestinians, those who are living in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, within Israel, and obviously in Gaza, is tremendous. Tremendous. I saw a video a couple of days ago of Trevor Noah from The Daily Show. Aziz, did you see this one?
Yeah,
So
very good.
Yeah, he's talking about, let's talk about power on both sides, right? And how Israel has tremendous power over the Palestinians. And I think it's important to understand that Israelis don't necessarily say things this way. I mean, they understand that they have more power. But if anything, they don't understand why they're not using more. When they're seeing the shooting in Gaza, what you're hearing in most of the Israeli channels, right, is why aren't we shooting more? This is the time to get rid of Hamas. And if we'll only shoot enough, if we'll only bomb enough, if we'll make Gaza into a parking lot, these are the terms, right? Then we could win in this round. And this is something that personally, obviously, I disagree with, but it was done before, it was tried before. And obviously, this is not helping. So the Israelis, I think, have a very hard time to understand where they are in this conflict. And I saw another question talked about the occupation. Why are Israelis having such a hard time to admit, right, to own that they have an occupation? This is the exact same thing. Because once they will see it that way, they would lose the legitimacy that they have in their eyes. And on that, we need mediation. We need someone to come from the outside and to give us as much help as needed, especially on days like this, where both sides are bombing, where building in Hamas are wiping down, where people are dying, obviously. And this is what I think.
So I just want to say, I have literally 50 questions that came to me on direct message, which I doubt I'll be able to answer all of them. So I'll try with a couple. One that is asking about, you write about American Jews. I've been thinking the same thing, but what then can be done, I guess, about the evangelical Christians? And I think partially American Jews engaging with evangelical Christians can be successful much more than Palestinians or other Americans engaging with, because they have this idea, it's like a philo-Semitic reality of like a Jew's kind of special in sometimes in a good way, sometimes maybe not, but they have this mindset. And I know it because I remember going once to this event and I met this this woman who was a leader in her Christian community. And I told her I'm from Jerusalem, said my name. She had no idea that Aziz, for example, is an Arab name. So she quickly assumed if I'm from Jerusalem, I must be Jewish. And she started telling me how much she loves me and she loves my people and she wants to give me a hug. And it was very weird and awkward thing. And I decided to play a game with it. Instead of telling her, no, I'm Palestinian, I thought, why the heck? Let's try and see what can I do with telling her I didn't tell her I'm Jewish. I just played with the game. And she was telling me about how it was when Obama was in office. And she was saying how she's angry at Obama because he won't bomb Iran for us, for the Jews. And so I took it and said, you know what? I don't want Obama to bomb Iran. I don't want anybody to bomb Iran. And she was confused. She's like, but what I hear in the news is that you want us to do this. I'm like, no, that's not necessarily true. And that engagement to her, I think, was really important because in reality, she's never met a Jewish person before. She still hasn't. But that engagement of American Jews with evangelical Christians to tell them, no, what you think Israel needs to be isn't it. Not every evangelical Christian is looking for the end of days destruction. That is a small minority. And yes, those are hard to deal with. But there are many who really just are misinformed. And talking to them would make a huge difference. Reaching out is one way we can make a change. Shai, pick a question. Or do you have questions, or you want me to give you one of the ones I got?
I have one, and I'll be happy also to hear your thoughts here. So the question is, people like Peter Beinart and others feel it is no longer possible to have a two-state solution? What do you feel about a single state with two people with equal rights? I'll start. Personally, this is something that I'm okay with, and I think that when we're talking about the future of this country and of the region, we need to remember the people first and foremost, and how do we get to everybody living here a life of equality and peace? That's only a question of strategy. So if it happens during a two-state solution, if it happens during a one-state solution, that's okay. But I think that we need to understand here that on the Israeli side, this is something that Israelis would have a very difficult time to go to. And the last couple of days, I think, have proven that or showed, I think, or emphasized a bit of the Israeli narrative. So when we're talking about what's happening in the riots that are happening within Israel, and we're talking about, as I said, both Jews and Arabs to be targeting one another, but burning each other's possession, we're talking about views like burning synagogues, that happened during the last couple of days, that takes the Israelis to a very sensitive part and a very difficult part maybe in their narrative, because no matter where they came from during the last century or a bit before that, they were targets themselves. And the idea of sharing the land right here without any kind of an advantage over the Palestinians, that is something that at least right now, I think most Israelis cannot accept. The idea that the next prime minister of Israel, if that would happen, if we are 50-50, right, 50%, 50%, all of us living here, including Gaza, West Bank, Jerusalem, Israel, the whole thing, and Israelis would lose that advantage, they see that as a very difficult thing. Same thing goes for the right of return. This is the one base idea of the state of Israel, that it pushes away Palestinians' right to come back here, those who've been who left or forced to leave after 1948. But any Jew, no matter where they come from in the world, can come here immediately and get a citizenship, which is something that in Jerusalem the Palestinians can get, at least not that easily. So to push away from that, or to tell Israelis, with all the animosity that you're having and with all the conflicts, share the land with the Palestinians and also see them as equal in the same country, that will be very difficult to do. And this is why I think personally that with all of the problems that the two-state solutions brings, and I don't know how possible it is anymore, this might still be the best idea to have. If that changes in the future, as I said, the strategy itself is less important as long as everybody can live here in peace and equality.
So I'm maybe adding to that question, another question I got about supremacy and Jewish supremacy in Israel. And in some ways that affects the question of how do you deal with one more powerful and another less powerful, and then what solution do you end up with? And I don't, this is where maybe Shai and I might have different opinions. I'm not sure anymore two-state solutions as we know it, the classic two-state solution really is possible. But partially not just because it's dead on the ground, the facts makes it really hard with growing settlements. I think just before these issues, the problems is the fighting, the violence, recently, Israel was on the path of legalizing, I think, about 100 illegal outposts. And those are 100 new settlements, basically, that would be authorized. And the moment they legalized, you'd see them growing quite fast the moment that happens. Right now, they smaller outposts, few dozen houses, 2 dozen houses, they'll grow even more. And so when I look at the two-state solution, I do wonder, where is it going to be? But the second thing I wonder about is which Israeli government that could be formed today that, or in the next 10 years, that could really get us there. And I see Likud as being in power. I see Bennett as growing in power. And even Yair Lapid, maybe, but I would not be as much betting on it. That it makes me very skeptical that two-state solutions as we know it would happen. I'll also agree that I don't see any of these guys accepting one-state solution. So we kind of stuck in a status quo. I'll push more personally for a confederate more level, where it is two states, but have a lot more flexibility, especially because of the settlements. But to be honest, talking about which solution is immature in some ways, because what we need to talk about is how do we get to a place where leadership or people push leadership to allow for that to happen. Unless we getting there, we can argue about one state, two state, three states. It means nothing if there's no will to make that happen. And at this point, there's no pressure, there is no incentive to make it happen. So we might want to focus our work on that. We might want to focus our work in some ways. And the second question I mentioned is how do we change people relationships? One of the worst things that happened in the second intifada is the building of the wall that separates Israelis and Palestinians. Kids now grow up never meeting somebody in the other side, never. The only thing they know is an enemy. I just spoke to a group when I was in Jerusalem that are about to join the army, the Israeli army. And I started by asking, how many of you have ever sat down for 5 minutes to talk with a Palestinian? 2 kids raised their hands. This is the real issue we have, is we already so demonized, so we see the other as less, and then you have a structural system, structural violence that makes it impossible. You have the wall, you have the police, you have the army, you have so many things that makes it so hard for us to see the others. So we pushing against tons of power, and that's why we need to mobilize people. That's why we need you to not be silent. We need you not just to tell your congressman or woman that, hey, we need you to stop this war, but to also pressure for real change, to pressure for a solution. The US needs to take more stand. The Biden administration has been, in my opinion, extremely disappointing. So disappointing that yesterday I was thinking, why did I vote for Biden? At least Jared Kushner read 25 books. It looks like Biden hasn't read any. It's frustrating. And I'm not saying, I don't want to go so hard to say I wouldn't have voted, but it does make me upset that nothing is happening before. It makes me upset that there is no ambassador. It makes me upset that this is kind of not a priority issue. And for it to become a priority issue, politics is local always. You pressure your congressman, you pressure your congresswoman, it becomes an issue. You don't pressure them, it doesn't. And I know Israelis like to say we don't respond well under pressure. I'm sorry, but I think that's bullshit because Israel hasn't responded well without the pressure as well. So whether that's pressure from Europe, whether that pressure from the United States, whether that pressure from Arab countries, whether that pressure from its own citizens, pressure works. That's how politics works. So I really hope we can put that pressure. I'll tell you, I also want the pressure on our own government, the Palestinian government. I want pressure for elections. I don't want the same guy who was voted 15 years ago representing me in the negotiations, because half of Palestinians haven't voted for him. Majority of Palestinians are under 35 years old, 70%. Those haven't voted for this guy. So the pressure also should happen on the Palestinian leadership. All right, next question. You got one, or should I pick?
I got one. The question is, can you talk a bit about class differences within your societies and how they play into what's happening? I think that's an important question. And I don't know if we have time for a whole seminar on both societies and the classes, but some things do play into this. And we need to remember that within Israel, right, we're talking about the citizens themselves, 75% are Jews, 25% are non-Jews, the majority of them are Palestinians, Muslims, Christians, Druze. And within those two groups, when we're talking about poverty, for example, the most poor groups are the Arab citizens of Israel and the ultra-Orthodox Jews, which are groups that have some things in common on many levels. The fact that they're citizens of the country, but they don't serve in the army, for example, that's that they have it all together, that one of the spouses, at least traditionally would stay at home and not work in those families, and obviously poverty and the lack of investment by the government. That pushes things. So when Israel built settlements from 1967, but mostly from the 1970s, many of the people who are moving into those settlements, and today they make almost 500,000 people within these settlements. I'm not talking about East Jerusalem here, talking about the West Bank. Many of them are ultra-Orthodox Jews that their life was so expensive in Jerusalem or around it that they moved and they crossed the Green Line, crossed into the West Bank to live in those settlements. Now, they are not necessarily ideological, talking about how Jews should live throughout the country and it's so important. They're very religious people, but that doesn't mean that Zionist ideology is big on them. But since they moved into those cities, they started to adopt that ideology. And what we're seeing is a shift in the Israeli sphere and the Israeli political system, that many more people are voting for the right wing, and it could be for that. The fact that governments on both sides, both left and right wing in Israel, have pushed people into moving into all those settlements. But we can also talk about the Arab citizens of Israel who are living in those mixed cities. Jaffa is an example, right? 2/3 of the people of Jaffa, they don't own the homes that they had before 1948. And Aziz mentioned that law before, the absentee property law that Israel had in 1950, that obviously put the people in Sheikh Jarrah, the families in Sheikh Jarrah, in danger right now of eviction. But that also means that a third of the Arab population in Israel lost their homes in 1949, 1950, although they became citizens of the country and although they stayed in the country itself. Many of them can live in the houses that they owned or other houses as protective tenants, but at one point they will be removed. And in Jaffa and in Lod, that's exactly the case. So you have one group that's not entitled to a property, and you have another group that is. You have a law that doesn't differentiate a Jew or an Arab, but pretty much tells you who gets what. And all those things together, kind of an expedited gentrification with nationalist aspects to it, that is all adding to the fuel. And I didn't even start to talk about the Mizrahi and Ashkenazi communities in Israel and their support for whoever they think was doing successful things for them and who are their leaders that they will support right now. But obviously, this is something that to get a whole better understanding of the conflict on all sides, this is something that we'll have to address.
I think we do have we have different classes also in within the Palestinian communities in the West Bank and Gaza. Unfortunately, the ruling class is the richest class. Then you got the non-profit kind of class, the development people class, which is problematic in the sense these are the European, mostly in US aid employees. They normally make more for a living than they work for organizations funded by the US government, US aid, and European government. And then you got everybody else who's usually, if you're gonna base it on any standards, are either around or below poverty level. Jerusalem, for example, which is under Israeli control, over 2/3 are below poverty level. So you have tons of poverty, but Gaza is like a whole different story, pretty much most of the places below poverty level. So it's when you don't have an economy that can exist on its own, meaning without permits from Israel, you eventually don't develop an economy and you stay dependent on aid. And I think that's the worst thing that the Palestinian Authority has brought us, is being dependent on aid. Until the Palestinian community is able to build their economy, the class system is going to be horrible. In Gaza, actually, talking about the class in Gaza, those who have money in Gaza have a lot of power. There are very few. But just today, actually, before we started, I showed this video to Shai of Israel targeting that class in the recent bombardment. And this is on Israeli television, it's not my analysis. Israel targeting the residential towers where the richer Palestinians live because they know they have more of a say on Hamas policy, hoping that it will push them to push Hamas to stop firing rockets. So that tells you how powerful or strong that class is. It is also, I think, problematic or criminal to be shooting at those residentials because they just have more money than others. So yeah, that gives you, I think, a little bit, as Shai said, we can go more deeper into that, but I don't think we want to do that now.
I have a question here that would follow this one, what you just mentioned, Aziz. So I'll ask you. The question is, why do the Gaza Palestinians continue to allow the presence and existence of Hamas and other right-wing groups to maintain power over them? Isn't there anything that people can do to turn that around?
I mean, I'll ask a question. What should they do? What could they do? They have protested against Hamas multiple times, and hundreds of thousands actually at some times have protested against Hamas within. They don't have power. And then it doesn't help usually around those times when that happens. Every time you get a war, people will, just like in Israel, people will end up supporting their leadership regardless what they are in times of war. The US is the same, Israel is the same, people in Gaza are the same. However, pollings show that if elections would have happened in May as was planned, Gaza would have lost the vote in Gaza. Hamas would have lost the vote in Gaza. They wouldn't have lost it in the West Bank. West Bank would have actually leaned more pro-Hamas because they're more angry at the Palestinian Authority. But in Gaza, most or a majority of people would have voted against Hamas, at least from every polling I've said or surveys that I've said before in the last month. So that tells you people there are not happy. But what can they do? We can't make elections right now. It's seen as if you are, and often in those kind of situations, that is a reality. If you are in a conflict, if you are under occupation, if you are in a war, then you don't really go over your leadership and fight your leadership. You try to fight the oppressor. And that's what gives Hamas a lot of strength, is every time they are threatened locally, they remind people, oh, but remember, we're not the enemy. The reason you don't have food is not us, it's Israel. The reason we have to limit your freedoms, not us, it's Israel. The reason, and especially now when people are so angry, shooting rockets, yeah, it's not gonna change anything in Israel, but for many people who are angry, they're like, it's at least giving us a little bit of justice. That's how people seeing it. It's okay, it's at least scaring Israelis. We live in fear, so they get a couple of days of living in fear. That's how many people in Gaza are interpreting it. They know there is no way Hamas is going to win. No Palestinian thinks, oh, Israel is going to lose because of those rockets. But they're seeing it as, we are in so much pain, let them feel our pain. It's not a way to do it. I think it's the wrong way to go around it. But that's what happens, I think, when people are desperate, is they just don't think about it rationally.
Yeah, I want to add to what Aziz had mentioned, to give maybe some of the Israeli side on that. Is I've seen in the last couple of days, there is a Facebook page called "Us on the Other Side of the Fence." That's the name of it, which is posts by Palestinians from Gaza, translated to Hebrew, and people are talking about their life. And on what we'll call normal days, I don't know if there's a real normality here, but on normal days, people are talking about their life and lack of water and the infrastructure. But obviously, in the last couple of days, people are talking about what they're experiencing in Gaza. People are talking about how all of a sudden the family is getting an announcement that they have to leave the apartment, and everybody run down. And when they look up to the building itself, they say it's collapsing, and they lose their homes. And obviously, that's not bringing any peace or anything that we can say is a positive thing. And I look for the comments that the Israelis are writing. And the interesting is that some Israelis will write something like, oh, you had it coming and you support Hamas or whatever it is. But other Israelis will try to give empathy by saying that Hamas is the one to blame. So they are completely taking away the responsibility, and they're saying, okay, if Hamas is a terror organization and Hamas is the one hiding in those buildings, then Hamas brought those rockets on you. And whenever you'll tell to the Israelis, okay, but you were the one to shoot the rockets, they say, okay, Israel has the right to defend itself and Israel has to shoot back because this and that. But they'll see Hamas as that one in charge or the one responsible. And that, I think, is something much more difficult to solve once this is the view that Israelis have, right? If also the legitimacy of Hamas is questioned here, then how do we come to a realization? How do we come to an understanding? Okay, we understand that the people of Gaza are not represented by Hamas necessarily, but could that bring us closer to an end of the conflict? Or to understand that we shouldn't shoot in the same way that we shot 7 years ago, 9 years ago, 13, 14 years ago, because it didn't lead to anything. So I don't know if that's a solution, but definitely it complicates things even more. Yeah.
So I just wanted to jump in and note the time. We're about 23 minutes past where we said we were going to be. So Aziz and Shai have both very generously offered to stay on. There's dozens more questions. And so they're very generously just lending their time to keep answering. But I know that that's not possible for everybody. So I just want to formally say thank you to them, and then we'll stay on and we'll keep doing questions. But I want to acknowledge Shai, one of our leading activists in Combatants for Peace on the Israeli side, and Aziz, one of our Palestinian board members, who are both just really wonderful. And we're so grateful to both of you guys for giving us so much time to answering all of these questions. I know there's a lot going on right now, and we're just very grateful to you. And to wrap up that same question of what can Americans do to help, you all should have my email, beth@afcfp.org. I can put it in the chat as well. Feel free to reach out. We have a Google group of activists and volunteers internationally. If you are in Israel or Palestine and want to get involved, please be in touch. And of course, as we talked about, anything you can do to financially support really does make an impact. And not just now when we're in crisis, but if you would consider becoming a monthly giver and supporting the movement year round, it really makes a difference. So please know that, and I'll turn it back over to these two for questions. We are officially closing the webinar, but we'll stay on and you guys can keep asking into the chat and keep answering for as long as people have interest.
So I got a question here I wanted to answer. It says, would the
Go ahead,
majority
Aziz.
of the residents of Gaza want to accept Israel's existence and make peace with Israel? If you ask them today, probably not. The majority of people are quite angry today. But I think in general, I would argue majority of people in Gaza, majority of people in the West Bank, majority of people in Israel do want to live in peace. I think most people, the absolute majority of people do want to live in peace. The question is, how do we get to a peace that makes everyone feeling secure and free? That's very important. But for me, it's important that Israelis, Jews understand this. And I'm saying this because I see so many of those comments on Facebook, on Twitter, is like, only if the Palestinians loved their children, there would not have been war. Only if the Palestinians, and this probably is one of the most painful thing to read because it's such a dehumanization of Palestinians. Palestinians do love their children too. They do want to have peace. They don't want, no Palestinian woman raises her kids to want to send them to die. And that's the same for Israelis. To separate and say, well, Palestinians don't love their kids is absurd. And maybe I'll take some words from Mahmoud Darwish. He says, we love life only if we get an opportunity to live it. That's one of my favorite sayings he has. We just want the opportunity to live that life. And I would argue majority of people in Gaza want an opportunity to live. Remember, they live under siege. They can't leave Gaza, not from Egypt, not from Jordan, not from Israel. They don't get products in unless approved by Egypt and Israel. They can't leave the country to study abroad unless approved by Egypt and Israel. And those approvals are extremely, extremely hard. You don't have a normal life if you live in Gaza. You don't have normal access. You don't have normal opportunity if you live in Gaza. And eventually, that kind of life radicalizes people. So, I believe today people do want peace. I don't know in 10 years if I can answer that the same way. And so every day we wait and let conflict get worse, we lose those kind of people. We've lost a lot of people in the West Bank. We've lost a lot of people in Israel, and we've lost a lot of people in Gaza because we haven't reached an agreement 20 years ago. And that's very reflected on the votes in those places. So hopefully we can learn and push for something to change much sooner than wait until more and more people get radicalized.
Same goes, I think, on the Israeli side. There is a survey that's been going on for the last, I don't know, 25 years or so, asking Israelis how many of you believe or how many of you would support the two-state solution. And we are in the last 25 years in a majority, right? People who support the idea. Sometimes it's 51%, and sometimes it's 60 something percent or 70%. But we have a good number of people to still support it. On the other hand, the next question usually asked in the following survey is how many of you still see that as something relevant? And this is something we see a decrease from year to year. So people would say we support it, but we just don't think it could happen. The fact that we would support it, I think, is a good enough of a point to start from. I remind you that up until 13 years ago, we had peace talks, right? Israelis and Palestinians. And we had many things that were understood between the sides, even on how to split Jerusalem. I mean, there were understandings, at least on some levels. But the question is, as Aziz said, how do we go with that? Are we losing more people when these things happen? Because people get frustrated. And every generation that grows into occupation, terror, this is something extremely difficult to try to change in their life, definitely.
You know, I saw a video today that was really, despite everything going on, that was such a, I don't know, uplifting despite everything. It was these kids whose home was destroyed and they were laughing and happy. And there's a camera and they ask them, why are you happy? And they say, we saved our fish from death. And it was such a heartbreaking, but also in the same time, to me, that reminds maybe people that those who are there are kids, are humans, are people who want to live, who care about the little fish to be able to save it. It's not because of the conflict and because of the bombings and because of all of that, you can either see Palestinians sometimes as an enemy or as a victim. And too often you can forget to see them as a human being. And so that, to me, that video was such a, I mean, very moving, very heartbreaking, but also very much giving me hope that these kids still care to save their fish. Do you want to pick the next question or you want me to go for one?
I have one here that I think I'll try answering. The question is, how do you answer people who say Israel withdrew from Gaza and it attacks Israel, so why should they withdraw from the West Bank? Which is a classic question that we hear often. So let's put some numbers and years and figures into that. Rockets have been flying from Hamas or from Gaza, not only Hamas, from the year 2001. And they increased throughout the years. And that might have led to the fact that Israel disengaged at 2005. But it's not that once Israel disengaged from Gaza, we started to see rockets. It was the other way around. Now, I joined the army in 2005. At March of 2005. And at August or July or whatever that was in the summer of 2005, this engagement happened. And I remember us troops were sent actually to take people out of their homes or to be one of the outer circles in that. And I have to tell you that as a combat soldier in those years, I was terrified from serving in Gaza. It was one of the scariest things that we could do. And when you're talking about the casualties themselves that we would have yearly, in the late 90s and in the early 2000s, they were much more devastating than what happened since 2005. So we have multiple, let's call them military personals who are saying that with all of the problems that this engagement brought us, we also saved lives. And the fact that we don't have to beat them over there and we don't have civilians inside and we don't have to put boots on ground, that's one thing. But the other question, of course, is how did we go? How did we disengage from Gaza? And the answer by Sharon at the time, because he was the one to do that with the support of Netanyahu, by the way, the Likud party, they led the disengagement, was that we shouldn't go and do that as a cooperation with the Palestinian Authority. And that, I think, is the biggest problem that we had, or the biggest mistake that we had at the time. Should have we empowered Mahmoud Abbas at the time and tried to hand over, as he was the representative of the Palestinians, to take Gaza Strip? Or did we just step out and say, okay, good luck to all sides, whoever takes it, and that's what we get? And in the last couple of years, with Netanyahu strengthening Hamas, understanding that they are an easier target for him than Mahmoud Abbas that calls for peace on many levels, yeah? that is trying to stop Palestinian terrorism to enter Israel, that has a lot more in the international legitimacy and support. He's an opponent on Netanyahu's level, and Hamas isn't. Hamas is someone that shoots, and no matter what, all Israelis will say, okay, shoot back, for almost all Israelis. So you have some level of understanding there. And obviously the West Bank is a much more difficult issue, and the numbers are huge. If we're talking about 8,000 settlers back in Gaza, here we're talking about 450,000 settlers. But if we're talking about Israel's security, and where do you see this country in the future? I say also go with the military themselves, go with people like former Colonel Shaul Arieli, that were the people that were running the peace talks on some level, and they will be the one to tell you there are some settlements that are impossible for us to really defend, and we have an advantage if we take them out. And I don't think that we'll take all settlements out in a case like that, but even some would be a change. I don't know if that's possible. I don't know if we're coming to that solution, but go with the generals themselves, and you'll hear many views on many levels on that.
All right. So I had picked a different question, but then as you answered with this, I thought I'll go with an earlier question asking, is the confederation really possible? And
Good luck, Aziz.
Usually I would say yes. Obviously, this is a time that's harder to say yes, just because reality now is problematic. I think it's yes for a couple of questions. One, for a couple of reasons. One, look, most of Jewish holy sites, most of Zionist, I would argue, connections to the land comes in the West Bank, not in Jaffa and not in Haifa and not in Akka. And then the counter, many Palestinians, when you go back to 1920s and 30s, the center of Palestinians' life in this country was Haifa and Akka and Jaffa. These were the centers of where Palestinians really flourished. More than Ramallah. Ramallah, by the way, was a village back then in comparison to Haifa and Jaffa. So by having confederation, you allow for a majority Jewish state, you allow for a Palestinian Arab state, but you also allow the flexibility of Palestinians living in Haifa and Akka and Jews living in the West Bank without them giving up the national symbols and all those aspects that are problematic if you want to do one state. So that's a reason I think it is possible. Probably doesn't feel possible again today. I think it might have to be stages. It might have to be, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. But the biggest work that needs to be done is kind of related to what's going on in Israel right now. We have to make sure Arabs and Jews can really have a real coexistence, not a fake coexistence. And what I mean by that, there with the years it's become like, hey, if we go and eat in an Arab restaurant, if you're Jewish, we have coexistence. Hey, if I work with a Jew, if I'm Palestinian, we have coexistence. And that's not coexistence. That's kind of like we managing to do what we have to do. There's no relationship. And unless you create relationships, equal relationships, where people also can argue with each other, can talk about the real issues, support each other, protest for each other rights, it won't work, not a one state, not two states, not three states. So that's why this, to me, that's what I focus on in my work, is how do I create those kind of conditions? Isn't it amazing that within Israel, 25% are non-Jews? How many do you think joint businesses exist between Jews and non-Jews? Yeah, not many at all. Very, very few in comparison. When it happens, it's a news item that tells you it's not a great number. There is no actual collaboration. So that's a part that comes to my mind in answering that question. Shai, your turn.
I'll take another question that kind of, many questions are following one another. Thank you for making our life a little bit easier. And the question is, why does it appear that the Israeli public is unwilling to engage or acknowledge the Palestinian Israelis, except for when conflict, violence, or civil unrest breaks out? And on some level, I think it's not that different than many other things in the world, right? When you're talking about a minority group who lives within a country, and is asking and shouting for their rights. And obviously, on a normal day, why should the hegemonic or the majority agree on some level, right? If Black Lives Matters wouldn't go to the streets, if the protesters wouldn't go to the streets and go and claim the rights that they have, then most likely things wouldn't change. I mean, it goes from American history, and obviously it goes here. But on some level, we also have a system of, how would I call it? It's segregation within the school systems in Israel, but it's something that the parents go with. We have 4 different education systems within the country that are mandatory, that are paid by the government. And these are, let's say, the mainstream secular, we have a mainstream religious, and then we have an ultra-Orthodox, and then we have the Arab Israelis or Palestinians Israelis who have their own education system. So when we think about it, to a certain degree, until the age of 18, those kids are separated from one another. And then at the age of 18, right, the Israeli kids, at least the secular ones, the ones who are not very religious, they'll go to the army. And then the first time that they're going to meet is going to be by the time that they reach university. So that could be the age 23, 24, as Israelis are famous in going to travel abroad once we finish the army. So you spend 25 years of your life without meeting a citizen of the country who could live on the side of the road, because we have many mixed cities, and you're just not aware of the situation. And I think this is one of the things that we're seeing in the last couple of days. I'm looking at the news, watching the news in Israel, and I'm seeing the shock on Israelis when they don't know what the other side look like. So we have a couple of years ago, the Israeli government passed a decision to transfer money to Palestinian cities within the country because of how neglected they were so many years. It's called Decision 922, talking about 15 billion shekels, which is a good portion of money, I guess not enough. But 3 years after, 2018, Israel passes the nation state law, talking about how Jews are the only group that should be recognized here as a nation, and anyone else who isn't. They don't even say Arabs, you're not. They don't even mention that. So by trying to say to the Palestinian citizens of Israel, hey, we can do an economical cooperation here as long as you're going to give up on your rights as a nation in this place. The fact that Palestinians in the education system in Israel, they cannot say the word Nakba, they're not allowed. We're not allowed to use that word. Nakba is the disaster of 1948. To acknowledge that Palestinians went through a loss, that doesn't mean that as an Israeli, you have to say, okay, we're going back into the borders of before. That just means I understand that there was a loss on the other side, and to solve that, we'll have to touch that subject. So I think the Israelis are working hard to try to avoid that. And that's why, unless you'll hear an unrest, and I think it's terrible to see when things like that happen, but we wouldn't hear or we wouldn't see a change. We wouldn't hear those things come up. And I hope that once the violence would calm down, and I really hope and pray that it would happen fast, those subjects will not be forgotten. And it will be understood that we have to treat things differently. And that's what I hope for.
All right. Greg is asking, thank you for this thoughtful, informative and sane program. Question: Combatants for Peace is sometimes accused of normalizing relationships between oppressed and oppressor. How do you respond? Well, I'll say you can look at our conversation and you can see this is not normalizing relationship. We're not saying, hey, I think I say that in my talk. There are people who do that. There are people who calling for calm, but really what they mean by calm, let's all have kumbaya and like each other and just, I don't know, that's it. Let's not talk about the problems. And let's not do something about the occupation. That's not what Combatants for Peace is doing. I would say my favorite thing about Combatants is that it's one of the leading organizations in joint resistance, not just dialogue. When they were trying to forcibly remove people who are Bedouins in Al Jahalin in Bethany, the first people who I saw there were my friends from Combatants for Peace, both Israelis and Palestinians. They were standing together. I'm talking about Sheikh Jarrah, Shai, who's in Combatants, was there. When you talk about quite a few issues that happen, Combatants is usually there directly dealing with the occupation, not saying, hey, let's not talk about it. Hey, let's just all be friends and that's it. Yes, we are friends, and I love my friends from Combatants and other Israeli friends as some of them as brothers. But we also work together to make a change. We're not just talking, we're not just dialoguing, we're not just feeling good about the situation. I would argue there are people who might be more complaining and doing nothing that are more accepting normalization than those in Combatants who are working hard at making a change. So that would be my response. Shai, if you have any other thoughts.
Yeah, on normalization, I think that's not something, of course, that we are addressing as Israelis. This is an inner Palestinian issue. But living in Israel gives you a choice, I think. Do you address, as an Israeli Jew, do you address the fact that you have supremacy in this country and you're trying to make a change with that? Or do you not? And what I think is important for many activists in the organization is to try to use that fact into bringing a change. One of the projects that we're involved with in Combatants for Peace is the activities that we have in the Jordan Valley. It's called the Jordan Valley Coalition, in which we wake up pretty early in the morning. We drive an hour and a half to Palestinian cities or small villages, usually Bedouin villages in the Jordan Valley, and we walk with the shepherds for a couple of hours with the herds, making sure that they will not be targeted with violence from settlers or the Israeli army. As on many days that we don't come, that happens, right? The settlers attack them, the army would come in and defend the settlers and not just, and obviously not the Palestinians, not obviously, they should do that, but things work differently. And this is something I think that's important because as we show up, the feeling is different, the army treats us different, and they know that we have cameras and we are connected to Israeli media and to lawyers, and if our existence there can make a change, then I think it's important that we come. And I understand the criticism. I understand it. Usually when an Israeli and Palestinian will sit together, yeah, the terms are not the same, right? When we're talking about rights, when we're talking about how the country treats you. But just saying that, I think is not enough. When somebody will tell me, when I travel abroad, they'll tell me, oh, you're an Israeli, I don't want to talk to you. I'll ask, what do you know about me personally? Would I say to a Russian, I mean, you must be homophobic? Or would I say to an American up until a year ago, you must have voted for Trump, so why do we need to talk? I would say try to see what did the person do themselves, what did the organization did, who are they connected with, and what change are they trying to bring, instead of just taking a tag of a country. But I have to say, I do understand many Palestinians on this level, but this is something that is tricky and complicated. Definitely.
Yeah, and I think because there are people who are normalizing, who are just for, even these days, I saw a few articles in Israeli news of highlighting Palestinians who are normalizing, who are saying, yeah, everything's good, we love Israel, everything you're reading is not true, Israel is the best country in the world, stuff like that. And if you live there as a Palestinian, like I just flew 2 days ago, I had to get stripped naked, only in my underwear, to pass it through Ben Gurion. I'm the only one who had to do that. None of the Jews passing through had to do it. So when somebody says that and I go, what kind of experience you having that is so different than mine? Because my experience, yeah, there are good things about Israel, there are bad things about Israel, but there are discriminatory actions, and that you can't deny, regardless how pro-Israel you can be. Your question or mine? Which one?
I have a short question, and so maybe we'll go to this one. The question was, can't find it, was about women organizations or women involved in these organizations. Yeah, as war and conflict impacts more and more women and children. So is there a feminist / women's movement for peace amongst both communities trying to find peace? There is. First of all, there are women in organization. I think women in peace organizations in general are, I think, I didn't check that, but a higher percentage than they are in many organizations in the country. But definitely check out Women Wage Peace. Let me put this in the chat for everyone.
And the Palestinian leader of Combatants now is a woman.
Definitely. And in Combatants, in many of the talks, the fact you are hearing Aziz and myself today and not two women happened to be. But before the event started, the conversation actually should have been between Tuli and between Rafa, one male and one female. but then we jumped in to talk about the conflict today, so we changed the order. Another one was about a coalition. I'm sorry, Aziz, for taking another question, just it's related.
That's
Is
fine.
there a coalition of all of you peace center organizations, New Israel Fund, Shalom Achshav, Trua, Women Wage Peace? That one actually, okay. And the answer is not officially, at least, but we do work together on many events. So let's say, for example, take the Sheikh Jarrah demonstrations. And we have the people in the neighborhood, of course, and we have Palestinian organizations that are coming from mostly Al-Fahim up north, but then combatants joined in. And we have Omdim Beyachad, Standing Together, which is an organization of within Israel citizens, Palestinian and Israeli Jews, that are there together, organization called Free Jerusalem that is important there. Ta'ayush is there, and many others. So we do team up, and New Israel Fund is a good way to see where the support is coming, but at least officially, not that I know of
Well,
one coalition that will be kind of a battle.
the joint memorial, which was a collaboration between Alliance for Middle East Peace, the Parent Circle, and was organized and started by Combatants for Peace. So that's an example. But I think that's really a good question, because I would argue our ability to succeed in making a chance is dependent on how much we're willing to work with each other. And the more segmented we are, the weaker we become. So I think Combatants have definitely been one of those organizations that pushes for that kind of collaboration. And I hope more and more of us really realize that we have to work together. I have to say it's not easy, because some of these organizations dependent on funding, and funding does not usually appreciate collaboration. So it's, as a movement, I think we are part of the same thing. As organizations, maybe we each have different direction, and we have to start thinking more as a movement than just as organizations. And I mean that for every one of those organizations. So that's one. I'm having here a question about a group in Maryland, Bethesda, DC area that is starting to meet together. If I'm still in George Mason, I'm not, but I still come to I'm not actually in the DC area even anymore, but I come to the DC area, hopefully, depending on how the pandemic moves, once a month or once every 2 months. So happy when you're meeting to come and meet you at some point. And then I'm having a question about the future of Palestinian leadership beyond Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. And that's a rough question to answer. I think, especially today, I would argue Palestinian Authority is in the weakest point it has ever been, because they don't know how to deal with the current crisis. They don't want an all-out war with Israel. They have to work really hard in convincing their own police not to get involved. They have to work hard in getting sure people are not reaching checkpoints, and they starting to fail at that. But that's at the expense of Palestinians feeling that their leadership has abandoned them, because they're not even knowing what kind of statements to put out. The statement 2 days ago from the spokesman of the Palestinian Authority said, "We are studying strategically what are the actions that we should do. We still haven't, we still don't know what are those strategic actions that they should do." And so people looking at that, looking at security coordination between the Palestinian Authority and Israel, and wondering, is this really an authority that represents us, or is it an authority that works for the Israeli government? That's how I would argue majority of Palestinians at this point in the West Bank feel. So what would happen after? If the Palestinian Authority was to be dismantled, which is a possibility, maybe it's a small possibility, but it is one, I think you get anarchy, and I think you get a lot of problems in the territories. Probably in the Palestinian territories, probably you'll have Israel getting much more direct involvement, and in some ways, Israel takes its responsibility as an occupier much more directly if that happens. Although there is a good chance also, because there are weapons of military anarchy, militant anarchy in the West Bank. That does worry me a lot. And then in Gaza, I think I don't see Hamas going anywhere anytime soon. Um, honestly, I'd say until we see a political movement or a movement toward a solution, it's gonna be hard for a change in politics, if that makes sense. And to make that change of making a solution, that requires all of us to rise up. And we don't need Fatah, and we don't need Hamas, and we don't need the Palestinian Authority to let us do that. I told Shai the other day, I'm like, if we were thoughtful before this, and maybe if we could convince people before this whole escalation happened to show up in Sheikh Jarrah at larger numbers, or in Al Aqsa at larger numbers, and having Israelis maybe show up at Damascus Gate, thousands of Israelis. I'll tell you, if people knew this is where we would have ended, I think thousands of Israelis would have showed up. But we get so complacent, we get so indifferent, and we get into like, oh, it's the same cycle, all right. If we were able to recruit enough people to show up, Israelis and Palestinians at Sheikh Jarrah, tens of thousands of people, I don't think the government would have dared to do what it did. If we did the same in Damascus Gate, I don't think the government would have dared to do what it did. And I think that would have weakened Hamas, that would have weakened Bibi Netanyahu, that would have weakened all these elements. But we didn't do it. And that's what we need to start thinking about. That's the future of leadership.
Maybe I'll take from your question to the next one, which is how will you change a white supremacy in Israel? I'll try to relate it to the things that Aziz said. First of all, I wouldn't call it white supremacy, as we're not so white, at least some of us. And I don't know if it's only a matter of, let's put it this way, it's a matter of race as well, but it's more a question of control when we're talking about the Israelis themselves. There is a supremacy in Israel, let's call it a Jewish supremacy. If you're an Israeli Jew, then there are some things that you're getting. Obviously, the right of return is the most immediate act. And the fact that no matter what, you'll have your rights, you can vote. And we need to ask ourselves, why do Israelis get it? Or why do they see it as something that they're not willing to give up on? And I think that different than what happened and maybe still happening in the States, this is not a question of seeing yourself superior than the other group. And I'm sure there are many Jews that the fact that they are the chosen people means to them that they should get more. But for the majority of Israeli Jews, I think the most important thing for them is protection. And the fact that Jews have went through the history that they went through, and it happened throughout Europe to North Africa, to the Middle East, to also here in the land of Palestine, Israel, from the 1920s and 30s and 40s and terror attacks and so on and so forth, I think they are having a very hard time, or we are having a very hard time to give up on power because we're intimidated by the future. And this is something that we need to work on, especially us in these movements, to meet with Palestinians. Once again, this is something that Israelis don't do, because where do you meet them? But then, or when you meet them at the checkpoint, right? As a soldier, checking them. For many Israelis, this is the first encounter. So the fact that we can sit together, and I could speak to Aziz, and I could see Aziz as a person who is just like me, who should get the equality in this country that I have, and that we can live here together, that he's not trying to take away, that the question is not, should I win or he wins? The question is, could we live together and win together? That, I think, is the important thing here. And this is one of the tasks that we have, which connects me to the next question, which is on Zionism, right? He asked, do you have any thoughts about the use of the word Zionist, which is now often used or taken to mean supporter of Netanyahu or Israeli extremist nationalism? Me personally, I don't see just the word Zionist as that much of an issue. If I support national movements, then I would support many others. I would support the Kurds. I would support people in the Basque people in Spain. And I would also support, of course, as an Israeli, I would support the fact that Jews could live here as a national group. But that doesn't mean that I should oppose the Palestinian national group. If anything, I think those two movements should live together. And of course, we have many interpretations of what does Zionism mean. Okay, before 1948, we know, but after 1948, after the existence of the country, the way I see it is not how the Israeli government sees it. I don't think that building another settlement is a Zionist idea. I think that living in peace and prosperity with your neighbors, that's Zionism. I think the fact that Rabin, that was one of the biggest Zionists of the country, had a peace agreement with the Jordanians in 1994, that added to the country much more than any other settlement could do. So the question, of course, is how do we take these words and ideas, and how do we talk about shared life and future together? I think these are very difficult days to, honestly, right, to talk about that, but that doesn't mean that this is not the solution. And this is not what we have to bring in order to live here in the future together. Aziz, unmute yourself, please.
I got another question. Where do the people living in Gaza migrate to during this conflict? I've seen them leaving Gaza, but what are their options for safe place to go? You didn't see them, unfortunately, leave Gaza. You've seen them leave their neighborhood in Gaza because they can't go anywhere outside Gaza. The borders to Egypt and to Israel are not open for them to migrate to during the bombings. So they're not leaving Gaza. In most cases, they might go stay with other families in other relatives of them in same area if they think there's more bombings in certain neighborhoods in Gaza, but they do not leave the strip. I mean, I've read stories of how people deal with it, but yesterday actually even Congresswoman Tlaib was speaking, and she was saying that about a mother who was saying every night she puts her kids to bed and they all sleep in the same room because if they die, they want to die together. Not some of them survive and some of them die. That's the reality of people I know in Gaza. I talked to a friend earlier who was saying his mom told him she's in Gaza, he's not, he's in Europe, and his mom told him every time she thinks she's going to die, she goes and dials a phone either at him or one of his sisters because that's what she want to hear the last thing before she dies. Every time there's bombing, she calls him. So there is really nowhere to go. And the trauma that people, the kids there are going through is beyond imagination.
We have a question here. Do you see any role of Americans or from other powerful nations, musicians, activists, or other performing on visual artists or actors or celebrities in helping in current and ongoing crisis or in bringing the next generations in opposing sides together? Or is it time only, in your opinion, for more direct action taking, such as calling legislators, etc.? I think why not mix? Why not have both? When many of the times we saw that having, let's say that having more angles to be brought in, getting more attention into the stories that you're trying to bring up could be done by anyone who's famous, anyone who gets a greater crowd. We had Richard Gere just a month ago when we had the shared ceremony, the shared yearly ceremony in Combatants for Peace. We had Richard Gere addressing the audience, and this is, of course, a greater or arriving to a greater audience as well. But I would say combining the both and not just choosing one over another. This obviously right now are critical times, critical days, and we need a ceasefire ASAP. This is the most important thing I can think of. And after that, obviously, bring in anyone else, anyone in that could talk about shared life and about the future of Israelis and Palestinians who are here together. I mean, we're not going anywhere. So bringing more attention into that and putting that on the spotlight is something that I see as a blessed activity. Aziz.
Shai, got a question maybe for you than for me. It says, I live in the UK and criticisms of Israel or support for Palestinians immediately seen as anti-Semitic. Have you got any suggestions on how to deal with this? Do you want to start and I'll offer a couple more thoughts? But I think you're probably more the right person to answer.
That's right. We need to check those things, I mean, specifically. And the easiest thing for anyone who's trying to defend Israel to do is just to shout anti-Semitism, which I find a disgrace. I mean, the fact that we had anti-Semitism so many years, and obviously it's still happening in the world right now, doesn't mean that this is what we should take out and flag and use and say, okay, this is anti-Semitism, let's move on. We should ask ourselves a couple of questions. And Natan Sharansky, who was the leader of the Jewish Agency, he did a test called the 5 Ds, right? And I don't recall all of them by heart, but first of all, I'm going to write his name in the chat box so you can look him up. But ask yourself honest questions on this. Will you criticize someone else the way you're criticizing Israel, or is it an only Israeli thing? This is something that Israelis usually say, right? You're using us, and the UN Security Committee is choosing criticism on Israel, but they're not doing that on Syria. So could that spotlight be of anti-Semitism or not? And I'm not giving an answer here, I'm giving questions that we'll have to see. But ask yourself about a certain ideology that Israel is doing or a certain act that Israel is doing. There could be that in the same sentence, your criticism on Israel could be anti-Semitic to a certain degree, some level, and another sentence is actually very just. He's talking about what Israel is doing in the West Bank or the fact that some people have rights and others don't. So I just think that we have to be sensitive to this subject, and you have to know the facts well. Once you know them, you can answer. And once again, some criticism is legit and should be answered, and something else is just not. To say that you Israelis are using
Shai,
the water of the West Bank, yeah.
I think maybe I misunderstood the question, but I think the fear people have, and I hear that here in the US, is if you get labeled as anti-Semite, this affects your life. This affects, I mean, there's an organization here in the US that puts you on a list and sends messages to your job and to your boss and so you don't just get labeled anti-Semitic, it actually could affect you. And so people end up being afraid to criticize Israel. Like even now, people who want to say, "Hey, stop the bombing." Hey, why you not instead saying it about Hamas? You anti-Semite. I already got called anti-Semite this week because I was writing about one of those things, and that scares some people. How do they deal with that? How do you really counter somebody who's calling you anti-Semite who's not anti-Semite? If they are, then hey, they deserve it. But if
Yeah.
you're not anti-Semite, how do you deal with that criticism? What do you tell people who call you anti-Semite?
Then I think that this is exactly the issue, that you have to know very in details and in depth what are you talking about. So if you are talking about how Israel shouldn't exist and the Jews don't have any right to exist, and Israel, no matter what, as an entity, is doing wrong, I would say some levels of that as anti-Semitism. I would. But if you're talking about specific acts of Israel, if you're talking about killing civilians who are not involved in fighting, which is what's happening right now in Gaza, if you're talking about the distribution of water in the West Bank, which is unequal and criticized by the UN or by the EU or both, then you're talking about a specific cause. And I think this is a very problematic field. I agree with you. This
Right.
is, yeah, this is risky and this is not easy to do.
Can
But
I
that
add?
doesn't, yeah.
Can I add one more? I find it helpful to often quote Israelis than me sometimes saying things. So I'll give you an example. I mentioned to you earlier about the residential apartment that was building that was destroyed, and that how it was destroyed because it has richer families and so on. Now I could tell you that's the reason, but that I don't first have really the resources. I instead quote the Israeli journalist who reported on it from one of the main TV stations in Israel. He's not just even like working for one of those smaller media outlets. He's one of the main journalists for one of the main stations. So I quote him, and then I find it harder in most cases. You're still gonna get sometimes people to call you that. I find it harder for people to call you anti-Semitic when you're like, I'm quoting Israeli Jews who are saying 1, 2, 3. I'm quoting, the people who live there. Can you in the UK, as whatever an evangelical Christian or an English, you know more really? Do you want to argue? If you do, then argue with the person there. Don't argue with me. That's one of the ways I found helpful, is to depend on facts coming from the ground and less of my own analysis sometimes.
I agree with you. Definitely, this is helping, I think, by using the right people and the right columnists and the publicists. Do you have a next question, Aziz, ready?
There are a few. I'm trying to remember which one.
I have one in the
Which
meanwhile
one
if
to
you
go
want.
for? What is it? Do you have one ready?
I have one ready, but it's about Israeli politics, and I'm trying to do more Palestinian. I'll answer that briefly. The question is about Lapid, Yair Lapid, the leader of Yesh Atid party. What do you feel about Lapid? He's been talking like a true statesman these past days. Yair Lapid has, in some way, I'm not sure exactly how, but he managed to become the leader of the centralist party in Israel. And although he's not really left wing, and although he's not talking about the solutions and the future the way that I think we would like him to speak, it seems that in many ways he's for sure much better than Netanyahu, a much better option to have than Netanyahu. He grew up, he did a lot of right ideas in the last couple of years. He didn't join with Netanyahu no matter what, and he did a true and honest attempt to replace him. Now, what Netanyahu is trying to do in the last couple of days, and the war is a part of that, he's trying to take us to a fifth election that will be personal elections. He's trying to ask not only vote for a party, but vote for your prime minister, knowing that he has his camp, his Netanyahu camp all sorted out. They all want to vote for him. The ultra-Orthodox parties, Shas, Yadut Torah, the settlers, even Yamina with Bennett. And Lapid doesn't have that. Lapid has much more friction. The camp, he has the Arab members of parliament in his camp, and they don't love him, although they think he's better than Netanyahu. And if we are getting to those fifth elections and we are going to personal elections, then I think that we need to do whatever we can in order to give Lapid that chance, knowing that he is the only one that has any kind of a chance to replace Netanyahu, knowing that he will be better, and also knowing that he's not perfect and he doesn't speak our mind the way that we would like him to have. I'm talking about the left wing in Israel. He's not even left wing. I wouldn't call him that way, but he does speak about those things in a better way. Similar to Biden on some levels, maybe, but this is what we got.
All right. Sorry, I was responding to one question in writing because I thought we don't need to go over it with everyone. And now I lost the question I was going to ask that I found. Oh, is there a coalition of peace movements like with Women Wages Peace, NIF, Shalom, Shalom Achshav, Givat Haviva? There is no organization of all of us like being in. There's an umbrella of coalition, I guess, of us working together, but not being one body, if that's the question. I'm not very sure what's exactly is the question here, so you can clarify if that didn't help. And Shai, anything you got? I'm going through. Oh, Shai, have you read the book Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor? Because I haven't, so I can't really. I'm asked about what I think about it. I haven't read it. If anything, I'd suggest you read Sulaiman al-Khatib new book, which will be much more aligned with what we talked about now. And that's in general. I find it problematic worldwide, not Israel and Palestine. Israelis read about Palestine from Israeli authors, Palestinians reading about Jews from Palestinian authors, Americans reading about the whole world from white American authors too often. And if you really want to understand a place, don't go to the most necessarily popular book that's written from an outsider point of view, and find a local story, somebody who's written from a local country, from the local community. So that would be my my advice in general. So if you read Yossi Klein Halevi, don't think of it as a book about Palestinians, because it's his perception about, it's what an Israeli perception of a Palestinian. But if you want to know what Palestinians think, please read what a Palestinian writes, and vice versa. If you want to read about Israelis, as much as I'm involved in Israelis, you don't want to read me necessarily. Yeah, if you want to read what Palestinians think about Israelis, you can do that, but you'll need to read an Israeli author for that.
Yeah, maybe have both, right? But know each time
right.
who you're reading and what they have.
I agreed, absolutely.
I have a question here that I wonder what to answer. I don't know the answer, but let's go with it anyway. Yeah, so it says, can you give us one example where Israel is not racist with Palestinians? So the question is, what should we do? There is not even an Israeli nationality, but an Israeli nation. So what should we think? I'm not sure on how to answer this question, but I'll try to give maybe some background to it. The Israeli, let's say, law system is sophisticated enough to not have any laws to mention that Palestinians within Israel should be discriminated, right? It shouldn't say that, oh, an Israeli Jew should not be tested or scanned in the Israeli airport and a Palestinian would. But then when we show up at the airport, Aziz and myself, we know who's going to get which fit. And this goes so on and so forth about Israeli towns that should be built and the Arab land that will be confiscated, which is a story of 1976 Earth Day. I mean, it really goes this way. That means that we have to tackle those things, and that doesn't have to be in the law system. We just need to find them and we need to work with them. And there are many organizations in Israel that do exactly that. They're trying to find where are those gaps and how can we bring more money to be shared in an equal way? How can we make sure that the laws would work in a certain way? Those are organizations could be Iramim in Jerusalem, an organization that I have a lot of appreciation for their work to show how Jerusalem works in an unequal way, although the law itself wouldn't necessarily discriminate it. Or Adala, that does it for the Arab citizens of Israel, or Sikui, that does it in the northern part of the country. That just means that it makes life a bit more complicated because we don't have one law that we can kind of point to. Of course, Israel passed in 2018 the nation state law, which made life easier on some level because Israel said loud and clear that it chooses one group over the other. But imagine that until now, until the year 2021, there is no Israeli nationality. Yeah, when we go and we get listed in our IDs, you're either a Jew or you're not. When Israelis ask to be written in their nationality as Israelis, Supreme Court has actually overruled against them, talking to them or saying to them that there isn't something like that. So this is a very basic understanding that we have here in the country and something that we have to tackle, but it's only making life more complicated in order to find those things and to go and address them. Aziz, do you want to add anything on that or continue?
No, I agree. I was getting a link to Suli's book, and I'll put one to one of my books, the most recent.
Yeah.
Just hey, if I'm promoting Suli, I'll also promote myself. But which really, I've read Suli's book, and it's incredible. So I think it's totally worth reading. And if you later want more suggestions for books, feel free to reach out and we can send you a list of potential books to read. Morning in Jenin is another good one, I think, to read from the Palestinian authors. I think maybe we can, it's been over 2 hours, so maybe we should come to a, oh, you got the books there. I see Evelyn holding the book. Nice. I'm happy you're reading it. And to be honest, it's spreading. I mean, people ask what to do, and Beth has given some ideas, but I would argue another thing you can do, which I remember. So I worked in the School of Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason for a few years. And I remember once coming across this talk by somebody who's considered one of the founders almost of this academic field of conflict resolution. And he was being asked about working in areas where there was an intractable conflict, where there seems to be no hope, where it felt like everything is just, it's all about destruction, it's all about pain. And they said, what do you do? How do you stay hopeful? Or what do you even do in the face of so many problems? And when you feel nothing you can do is able to make a difference, what keeps you going? How do you do that? And he said, when I have nothing to do, nothing else to do, and I feel hopeless, helpless, I continue to tell the stories. And you heard today many stories. I told you some stories. Shai told you some stories. And I think one thing you can all do, and that's an easy one, tell the people around you, tell your friends, tell your community, tell your family, tell everybody you know the stories. That's how we get this word going. That's how people know that there is a difference. Otherwise, they wouldn't. So please keep telling the stories that we told you. Keep telling the stories of people who are working together. Tell the story of Combatants for Peace. Tell the stories of the other organizations that are doing incredible work, both Israelis and Palestinians. These are not stories told by the media. So somebody else has to tell it. And you, the ones who can do that.
I agree. And I think that these are the times that we're most needed. And talking to Israelis who are not activists, who are not peace activists, in the last couple of days, people are asking me, what, are you still going to go to Sheikh Jarrah with all the violence and you're doing talks and speaking to people? I think that this is the most important time that we can do these things and continue the same things that we're doing daily and fighting for a better future for ourselves and our families and our children. And we understand that there's a lot of smoke now up, but that smoke will fade at one point. And in the end of that, it's going to be Israelis and Palestinians. Nobody is going anywhere. We are here to stay. And the last thing that we would want to do is to avoid talking about these things and seeing the future. I think leftists in Israel, Israeli leftists are asked, like, if you have so much criticism to Israel, then why are you here? We're here to change it. That's exactly it. If you have a problem with a place and you're not doing anything to change that, then how could that place become any better? And no place in the world is perfect, and no place is I don't know, was that good 100 years ago. We're pushing for a change, and it takes a long time and commitment, and it's not easy, but this is exactly what we're here to do. Okay.
Yep. And if you need to reach out to me or to Shai, I think Beth is Combatants would be happy to give you our contacts, or those who ask me directly, I gave it to you. But yeah, thank you so much. And Beth, do you want to add anything